All right, hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Cold War, chapter 33. All right, for this, you are going to want to have your questions, okay? You're going to want to have the main PowerPoint to take notes. All right, and let's get started, okay? Date range for this chapter is 1945 to 1975. So even though the Cold War goes to 1991, we'll talk about how it wraps up a little bit in chapter 34, but the major events of the Cold War really kind of go through the 1970s, and then things kind of start to die down in the 1980s. So even though it's officially over 1990, 1991, when the Berlin Wall comes over and the collapse of the USSR, we see the really heightened events 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, okay? And that's what we're going to really focus on as the heart of. Geographic location of the Cold War: Europe, Asia, North, South America, Africa. I mean, this truly is a global, as Winston Churchill said, curtain, iron curtain, that falls around us, right? It's a global curtain or tension that we feel. Key civilizations or groups. Obviously, the Cold War is between two major groups, right? US and USSR, Soviet Union. And then you have all these other countries that fall in line, okay? And it's not even really communism versus democracy, it's communism versus anti-communism, okay? And that's really becomes the separation of the world that we see. All right, so let's get started. Hot, warm, cold. What is this actually about? So a war is when there's actual warfare. So how can it be a war but it's cold, okay? It's when you have this pressure, so talks are going on, war is planning, the operations just aren't really actually being followed through. So what we have with the Cold War is that there's no real front line. There's constant planning for war, there's constant espionage, there's constant planning, tensions, it's almost. And this really is 40 years of almost, or a lot of proxy wars like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Cuban Missile Crisis, crisis in the Middle East. But there is never really a frontline conflict between the two major power players, which is the Soviet Union and the United States. Okay, so the Cold War is this constant almost, but never real follow through. But then a constant divide as small countries, through decolonization, countries become independent. They choose one side or the other. And this literal splitting of the world between communism and anti-communism. So what are the origins of the Cold War? What are the causes and the onset of the Cold War? How did this come about? How does this even start? Okay, well, let's take a look at that. All right, the state of hostility, it's a state of hostility without actual warfare. All right, it stimulates the development of merging economies or merging nations. All right, it's a buildup of arms without actually using them. And it lasts again till the end of the Soviet Union, which will be 1991. And it starts really immediately after the end of World War I. We see the dividing up of Germany. We talked about this, right? And they haven't even divided up Germany to oversee its, recovery, and Soviet Union and US immediately are in conflict, okay? So what are some of the causes? Well, World War II. Immediately, it's right back to the moment that Hitler is defeated, they're right back to the old rivalry. The alliances fall apart. The USSR felt that they weren't recognized in their portion of Germany, and they were intimidated by the United States having the bomb. So the competition of, military buildup, the use of the bomb, and then the hatred for communism was very evident, and that was alive and well the moment that the greater threat of Hitler and Nazism was removed, and then the war in Asia was ended. The tensions and resentments, there's an arms race going on, the atomic bomb, the fear of socialism and communism of the West, the tensions in Germany, the Berlin blockades, and then eventually new alliances arise. Alliances are very dangerous. It feels good to have someone have your back, but when you quickly build up, we've seen World War I, how it was a domino effect. World War II, it's a domino effect, and that could very quickly be a World War III. US wanted to spread democracy. They wanted to spread capitalism. We didn't want to be isolated. Soviet Union wanted the same thing. They didn't want to be isolated. So everybody's trying to spread their cause, and in doing so, it causes a worldwide divide. Or as as Winston Churchill coined it, this iron curtain, that divides. And really it starts in Europe, spreads across Asia and the rest of the world. So post-World War II, one of the first onsets or events that kind of kicks off the Cold War is going to be the dividing of Germany. So even though this isn't officially the start, the events or onset of it, we see with the tensions in Germany, okay, the divide of Berlin. So you had kind of 4 divides. So you had France having one section, Britain having one section, America having one section, which were in relative harmony, and then you had the Soviet Union having one section. The problem was that the Soviet Union didn't feel safe or accepted by the other 3. Well, there was some truth to this. Nobody was getting along and nobody wanted to play with the others because, again, Soviet Union was communist, the rest were not. So those old tensions quickly came back to the surface. So what did the Soviets do? They blocked the major roads in and out of Berlin, not allowing the U.S. into their portion of Berlin. Because you have to understand, the Soviet Union controlled that part of Germany. So the capital city of Berlin was itself subdivided, and the Germany itself was subdivided. The capital city, though, the surrounding area around the capital city was controlled by Berlin. So access in and out of Berlin was controlled by the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union didn't declare war. They just cut off access to the roads in and out of the city. So they said, sure, you can have your portion of the city, but you can't have access in and out of the city. Well, what is the U.S. supposed to do? Well, you would expect them to get hostile and, drop bombs or something like that, but that would start another war. So you have to find a way around it. So what did they do? So the Berlin blockade by the Soviets led to the Berlin airlifts by the U.S., the Allied powers, dropping in supplies to their people in their sector of Berlin. So for a year, the U.S. daily would drop supplies, things they needed, communications, whatever they needed to their portion of Berlin and their people of Berlin because the Soviets wouldn't allow them in and out. Well, of course, the Soviets couldn't shoot down the plane because that would be an act of war, right? They denied them access to the road, but they couldn't deny them access by air. That would be an act of war. The U.S. couldn't go in by road. That would be an act of war, so they went by plane. Welcome to the Cold War. It's constant flexing. It's constant kind of poking without throwing a punch. Eventually, the tensions get so bad in Berlin that a few years later, or a decade later, I should say, the Berlin Wall goes up, right, separating Eastern and Western Berlin. West Berlin is anti-communist, free, liberated, and then East Berlin becomes communist and a part of the USSR. And this city becomes kind of an epicenter or microcosm of the Cold War. And if you tried to jump from one side of the fence to the other, people jumping from east to west, you could be shot. And this will become the symbol then of the end of the Cold War when this is torn down in 1991. This is the Charlie checkpoint, people going from east to west or west to east. And again, one of the very, very tense spots of communication during the war, during the Cold War. So the U.S. develops policies during the Cold War to try to bring people to their side. And the Soviets will do the same, okay, trying to appeal countries to their side to build up support. The idea was that they knew they couldn't end communism. That would be World War II. So the idea is to try to contain communism, okay? If we can't end it, let's at least not have it spread. So how do we do that? So this was really the goal going into a good chunk of the Cold War. How do we contain what is happening? So they came up with 2 different things, and this could be a part of your response, okay? They're going to have the Monroe Doctrine and the Truman Doctrine, okay? So the Marshall Plan, and the Truman Doctrine. So the Marshall Plan is going to be giving financial aid, and the Truman Doctrine is going to be kind of their way of approaching the world, okay? So they're going to be leaders in the world fighting against communism. So they're going to help new countries through decolonization resist communism. Remember when I said that decolonization and the Cold War go hand in hand? So as new countries are decolonizing, they kind of said, they're going to kind of step up and say, we have a responsibility. think back to white man's burden, okay? Now this is U.S. burden, okay? They're going to say, we have a responsibility to save them from the big bad communists, okay? So we're going to offer aid to countries who are being victimized by communism. Welcome to Korean War. Welcome to Vietnam. Welcome to several conflicts where we stick our nose where it doesn't necessarily belong because we claim that we are fighting against communism. We are saving, I'm saying this in quotes, people from communism. So this will be the Truman Doctrine. We further that by saying not only will we give aid through the Truman Doctrine in political and military support to fight communism and try to contain it, but then we will give financial incentive, okay? So imagine, so causes are World War II tensions, you know, resentments, the atomic bombs, fear of communism, okay? So the onset or events, you know, how this is coming about if you're looking at your chapter questions, you know, the onset is Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, okay? Now that we've given you military aid, how do we convince you that our side's better? Well, that's what talks, money talks, okay? We are going to give you financial support. So we provided billions of dollars to Europe, billions of dollars to new nations in Asia, in Africa, doing anything we could to appeal to that Middle East, to appeal to these countries. You don't even have to be democratic. You just have to sign a pledge you won't be communist. So we've set the bar pretty low, and we will give you money. So if you're a new country and you're looking for money, let's be honest, you're just looking for a good deal. U.S. is offering this to you. They give you military aid. They give you money. You sign up. And this is the reality. You have to join a side. Everybody's joining a side. Nobody's not joining a side. You're a sitting duck. So at this point in the world, you join a side for protection, for your own self-interest. So the Marshall Plan and Truman Doctrine was our way of containing communism. And then we decided we would form our own trade alliance, which became really a treaty alliance, okay? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So countries basically that created a trade agreement that we would only trade and do business with other anti-communist countries. So again, didn't even have to be democratic, you just had to be anti-communist, all right? So what kind of countries were these? Well, basically, countries bordering or surrounding the Atlantic. So most of these were European or fringing on the Middle East, and then in North South America, okay? So hence NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So if you've ever heard of NATO, this was established during the Cold War and became kind of the anti-communist alliance group, which was a military alliance, but then later kind of morphed into a trade alliance. Well, of course, the Soviet Union is not going to sit back and not have their own group, right? They have to have their own group. They have to have their own, you know, reaction to this. So if you're looking at onset, this could be another part of it is not just the, you know, the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine, but you have the formation of the alliance NATO for anti-communist led by the U.S. And then you have the Warsaw Pact formed by the Soviet Union in response to NATO. Again, another military alliance built up of Eastern Europe and other countries in Asia and throughout the world who are for communism, who represent communism. China will eventually join this as well. So first you have getting countries to join. We'll give you financial aid. We'll give you military aid, okay? Another part of the onset is you have an arms race, okay? Now, it's no longer who has the most guns, who has the biggest ship. What's the new level of showing off, okay? Well, there's two things, the atomic weapons and the space race, okay? So atomic weapons, we won, right? We were the first to drop an atomic bomb, and then within a year, Russia had their own, the Soviet Union had their own, and then it went to hydrogen and nuclear weapons, okay? Then the next thing was the space race, okay? Who was going to be the first to get into space? And we didn't win this one. The Soviet Union won, okay? The Soviet Union won in 1957. They were the first to launch the successful satellite into space and the first to do a successful rotation around our planet. Of course, we were not happy about this, okay? Being beaten. This was a hit on our pride. How could they? And you have to understand, every time the other side won something, it really wasn't about what they won. It was about communism versus anti-communism. Oh, look, communism won. Oh, look, anti-communism won. It was about the reputation, okay? And then this further perpetuated us trying to get then to the moon, right? Once they had something that rotated, you know, the first satellite, then we had to be the first to get on the moon, you know, with Lance Armstrong. So it's not Lance Armstrong, sorry, you know, but our first, the space race and stuff. Lance Armstrong, that's bicycling. I am totally off on that, sorry. I need to eat lunch. I haven't eaten lunch yet, so I should have eaten lunch before I recorded this. So totally my bad. All right, but it's the idea that every time we can one-up each other, it's not really about what we're pursuing. It's about the reputation and drawing others. It impresses other countries, okay? And the media frenzy, the propaganda. So today we do it with social media, right? We do it with social media. We do it through TikTok. We do it through Twitter. We do it through you know, through all these other platforms. At this time, it was newspapers, it was, you know, media outlets, it was your headlines, you know, and it was embarrassing for us. And this was a big hit for us after the atomic. We had kind of reigned the first part of it, so this was a big hit to our reputation. In 1952, we were the first to test a hydrogen bomb. Soviets tested shortly after us. They were the first to launch, you know, a satellite into space. We were the first to have Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin to walk on the moon. And so it was constantly tit for tat, tit for tat, tit for tat. The Cold War is a bunch of almost and then showing off, constantly showing off. Then we have a series of what we would call proxy wars, okay? And proxy wars are about, they're wars within countries, but they really are representing the bigger issue of communism versus anti-communism, okay? So Korea is going to be the first example. The Vietnam War is going to be another example where these countries unfortunately fall victim to the bigger issue. Okay, so after the war, after World War II, several countries were occupied. Germany, Japan, and Korea were occupied by Allied forces. Okay, but also the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union occupied Germany along with the Allied forces, and they occupied Korea. So in Korea, they occupied the north, we occupied the south. So in 1950, another example of this aggression is that the northern troops were given permission to invade the south. So the north invaded the south, and the UN condemned this. The United Nations condemned this and sent troops to support the US, and we were able to push back to this line of demarcation right here, okay, that we see, that is still the line that separates, the 38th parallel that separates North and South Korea. But for 3 years, there's fierce fighting between North and South Korea. The North being supported by China and by the Soviet Union, the South being supported by the UN and by the US, all over communism versus anti-communism. And here's what's sad about the whole thing. Both of them had terrible, terrible leaders. Neither leader was good. We weren't backing a good leader, and the North wasn't backing a good leader. So it really wasn't about fairness and what was best for the people of Korea. It was about communism versus anti-communism. It was about the agenda of the outside world being played out through the people of Korea, all right? And not the people of Korea getting what they wanted, but outside entities taking over. Finally, in 1953, again, a peace deal was made at the 38th parallel, and still to this day, right? Still to this day, this is the line that separates North and South Korea. And South Korea is still one of our closest allies, and we still have a huge military presence in this zone. And North Korea is still very close allies with China and is communist. So this still is one of the few actual living examples of remnants from the Cold War era, and what we would call a proxy war. So even though it's within a country, it is a It is a small example of the bigger issue. So like I said, the communists supported the North, the US supported the South. And finally, the peace talks were reached in 1953. So many people died, no real conclusion actually brought to this. And still to this day, that line, that zone is still one of the most tense zones, in the world. Interesting fact, so the average height in North Korea is actually much shorter than the average height in South Korea. And you would think, same region, people and stuff like that, you would think that the average height would be the same. And that's due to such malnutrition in North Korea, that the average height is so much shorter. And in fact, in North Korea, the best example I could give, North Korea is kind of like Disneyland. Only in analogy. What I mean by that is that so much of it is fake. Pyongyang, their capital city, so much of the buildings are fake. So if you're at the border, the 38th parallel, and you look through binoculars and you see the building facades and stuff, most of them are actually fake buildings. If you've ever been to Disneyland and you see the facades of the buildings, they're facades, they're not real buildings. It's not a real castle. Sorry if that's like bursting your bubble. You're like, I thought all of Disneyland was real. No, it's facades, right? This is what North Korea does. It's a big fake show. If you've ever seen videos or documentaries done of North Korea, they're so limiting of what they let you in, and they guard what you can see because it's about putting on a show. If they actually let you saw what was going on, it's terrible. And so many people are now malnourished. That's why they're so short, because of the malnourishment. So specifically, they send their tallest soldiers to the borderline, 38th parallel, to put on the facade that they are taller and stronger than they actually are. So you have to actually pass a height test to be sent to the 38th border if you are, or the 38th parallel border if you are a North Korean soldier, because they tend to be so short because of malnutrition. So this is the level of oppression that people in North Korea face. China in this era also falls to communism. World War II is a turning point, and after the war, they choose a side and they join up with Russia, with the Soviet Union, and become close allies with the Soviet Union, really leading the charge of communism during the Cold War. This is the era of Mao Zedong. He gains control, and the communist parties, the People's Republic of China, is communism, all right, begins, and is still a part of China today, all right. He starts the Great Leap Forward plan, launching industrialization, maximizing village levels industry. They go through a cultural revolution. And this is really about cracking down on the rights of people in China, mainstreaming how people live, and instituting full-fledged communism within China. New nations in Southeast Asia. Huge struggle. Part of it is because, like I talked about last chapter, it's kind of a twofold. You want to see nations gain their independence, but some nations also aren't ready due to lack of education, lack of industrialization, and just lack of experience, lack of infrastructure. So it's a really delicate process. We looked at the process for India last chapter and how hard that was because there was so much internal conflict between Hindus and Muslims, and the death rate just in the separation of India and Pakistan, and how difficult that was. And still today, one of the most tense borders in the world is between Pakistan and India. Very, very difficult. The decolonization process in Southeast Asia, very, very difficult. When the French moved out too quickly in Vietnam, it opened the door for extremists to take over, and it led to the Vietnam War. So there's a lot of issues with decolonization that leads to instability and a difficult time. Africa is going to have the same thing. Decolonization is really difficult. Nations deserve their independence. Don't get me wrong. 100% deserve their independence. You have issues also, though, where people don't want to let go. The French were determined to hold on to Algeria. They fought back. They won their independence. But in a lot of cases, in Africa, education is lacking, infrastructure is lacking, development is lacking, urbanization is lacking, and there's a lack of stability to set up free flow elections, uncorrupt elections. And so unfortunately what happens in a lot of cases is that when they gain independence, it opens the door for guerrilla resistance, kind of as it says down here. It opens the door for extremists to take over, and you just replace a foreign dictator, like we talked about with Latin American revolutions, for a local dictator. Or in some cases, let's talk about with South Africa. South Africa, when I say this in quote, gains its independence, it's really just colonists, white Europeans gaining their independence, but still oppressing the native people of Africa. So when we say it's independence, it's really a fake independence, right? It's kind of like Australia. Yes, they gained independence, but the native people of that region aren't actually in control. It's the immigrants, right, who have come there, who now have control and are still oppressing the people of that region. So for example, in Africa, right, we saw that with apartheid for centuries later, before finally Nelson Mandela, right, was able to be elected president and dismantle the apartheid system just a short time ago, barely 25 years ago, which is crazy to think it was just that short time ago. So Latin American freedom. So Latin America has been free, so to speak, for about a century, okay? They've been free of European rule. But the problem for Latin America is economically, they are still being used and abused. And actually a lot of that is due to the US. The example we saw last chapter, for instance, let's just take Mexico, for example. Mexican Revolution starts in 1910, and a lot of that was due in part to we were taking advantage of Mexico. We were bribing Mexican leader Diaz, right, and taking advantage of the oil industry. We were getting major supply of our oil well into World War I from Mexico and sabotaging the Mexican Revolution. We wanted an oppressive leader who was giving us the inside scoop to basically steal from Mexico. Cuba is an example of that. We were getting huge resources from Cuba, backing corrupt regimes, and then when Fidel Castro overthrows Batista, who we were in business with, we didn't like that. Now, Fidel Castro was no better than Batista, so this is another example of sometimes people feed on the emotions. So let's look at this for example. So Batista was a leader of Cuba for a long time, in business with the US, totally allowing us to extract resources from Cuba, which impoverished Cuba itself. So Fidel Castro comes along, a man of the people, so he said, right, gets the people to support him. They are, again, many of them poor, impoverished, uneducated, believing him, says he's for the people. He overthrows Batista, gets rid of, expels the US, okay, tells the people what they want to hear, and just becomes the next corrupt regime. So the people fall victim to yet another corrupt regime. They didn't know they were trading one tyrant for another. It's just another money-hungry, greedy man taking advantage of the people and feeding on their emotions. And they are uneducated and lack infrastructure to know any better or to know how to end it. And this is the cycle. This is the cycle that happens. Another byproduct of the Cold War is the fear of communism, but within our own country, okay? And we saw this with the McCartney witch hunts is what we called them, okay? And this was a big thing in Hollywood, all right? Anyone who showed any empathy, had any association, even had a friend, maybe just didn't speak out against communism, okay? Could be called in, could be put under FBI investigation, could be, for any reason, called in, ruin their career. If you've ever heard of the famous singer Frank Sinatra, who questioned the ethical practices of this. And just because he questioned their ethical practices, he was accused of being a communist. Now, he was not a communist. No evidence of it or any shape or form. But just because you question the government and what they were doing, they would come on a witch hunt against you. And we've seen this before in history, right, where you take the irrational accusation, and just because you don't get up and you don't declare someone guilty, people come after you, right? And so there was a lot of this going on in the US, that if you question the practices of our government, if you question the moral principles of our government, how they were going after people, how we were interacting with other countries, let's say like Mexico or Cuba or something like that, that you were somehow, well, if you don't like what we're doing, you must be a communist. It's like, no, just because I'm questioning your practices doesn't make me communist. It makes me question your practices. You know, it makes me question your moral principles. So we love to throw that accusation around. And once somebody questioned or labeled you as a communist, you were guilty by association, right? The fear of communism overruled everybody's mind. And whether or not there was evidence, it would ruin your career, it would ruin your reputation. And they could call you into the Senate and question you. And so there was a lot of this going on in the 1950s, 1960s, and stuff that was blown out of proportion. Most of it turned into nothing, and they even had TV trials, and people loved it and fed into it, and it roared up the fear mentality that people had, that a lot of it was baseless, that, oh, you can't trust your people, they must be a spy, they must be a spy. So there was a lot of this going on, ruining even a lot of our Hollywood elite at the time. Let's talk about Cuba here for a second, okay? Now, there's very little evidence that Fidel Castro's original goal was to create a communist government. Now, we know that he wanted to overthrow Batista, okay? We do know that. He did not have good intentions. We're not saying that Fidel Castro was a good man, but we don't have evidence that he actually wanted to become communist, okay? Plenty of bad men are not communist, okay? Just because you're not communist doesn't mean you're a good man, all right? Or that you're gonna have a good government, all right? But his problem is that when he overthrew the government, because of proximity to the US, I mean, they're less than 100 miles from our border, okay? He needs protection. You just made enemies with one of the most powerful nations in the world. And not only did you make enemies with us, we're mad because that's our cash cow, okay? We're making tons of money from Cuba. And you just got rid of a man that we were in business with, and you're darn right we're going to come after you. Like, things are not going to go down easy for you. So what are you going to do? How is this going to go down? So things got really hairy for him. So Fidel Castro, realizing that he's in trouble, and he knew he was in trouble because of the Bay of Pigs. In 1961, we sent in undercover by night CIA workers to basically try to assassinate a coup, to try to assassinate Fidel Castro, and it failed. The problem was that we were supposed to send in air support with this ground invasion, and we didn't. And in cahoots with some Cuban exiles. So there were some Cuban exiles, and we were supposed to send in some CIA workers to partner with them, and then some air support, and we canceled the air support. The air support didn't happen, and it failed. And Castro was able to escape. So this attack in 1961, called the Bay of Pigs, because they invaded the Bay of Pigs, failed. Fidel Castro, for good reason, was afraid for his life because we tried to assassinate him, needed protection. So again, at this time, you either communist or anti-communist. Well, the US just tried to kill him, so who does he run to for protection? The USSR. All right? In the meantime, the US had put several missiles in Turkey, who was our closest ally, bordering the Soviet Union, okay? We had put a bunch of missiles in Turkey, which was the closest border that we could get to the Soviet Union, and we were pointing them directly at the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union was super, super mad about this, all right? They did not like having missiles pointed in their backyard. Who of us would like having missiles pointed in their backyard? Now, the cool thing for us is that we've always been fairly isolated, right? Insulated, I should say. Isolated and insulated, okay? We have two major oceans called the Atlantic and the Pacific, okay? To insulate us or isolate us from threat. Soviet Union didn't have this. They were super mad. So when Fidel Castro comes calling and says, hey man, would you want to accept me in the club? Fidel Castro's like, welcome to the family. All right, welcome to the family. Why? Because this is close proximity to the US. He has not had any close proximity to the U.S. Soviet Union's had no close proximity to the U.S. So Soviet Union, this is the best thing that could ever happen to them because now they have an ally that's within 100 miles of our borders. And for the U.S., this has never happened before. And hence then they are able to take missiles, place them in Cuba, and point them at our major cities. Look at that embrace, okay? Khrushchev is like, Castro, you are the best thing to happen to me since sliced bread, all right? You are, look at that smile. Have you ever seen a more happy man in your entire life, okay? Look at that. Like, you have made me so happy, all right? Now, so it's funny because in history, we often think that the Cuban Missile Crisis was an unprompted attack on the U.S. Like, how dare they point missiles at us? We did nothing, okay? Well, actually, we did kind of start it. One, whether or not we had a right to, we did try to assassinate Fidel Castro, okay? This pushes him into the arms of communism. It does, right? The man we just tried to assassinate him. Big bad U.S. is coming after him. What's the guy going to do? No, I'm not saying he's a good guy at all. This guy is terrible, okay? But he needs protection, so who does he run to? USSR. Look at that embrace, all right? Have you ever felt more welcome in your life? Look at that, all right? And the USSR is like, oh yeah, US, you have it coming, because we had put missiles in Turkey and we're pointing them at the major cities of the USSR. So now USSR, Soviet Union, has a chance to pay us back, so to speak, or intimidate us back and place missiles in Cuba and point them at us. So here was the Bay of Pigs attack that did not go well. And we kind of sabotaged ourselves by not giving the support that we should have. That goes badly. Fidel Castro then joins the USSR, and then missiles are now pointed at us. And this probably is the closest direct threat to the Third World War that we see during the entire Cold War, okay? Where literally Kennedy is on the phone with Khrushchev, and they are like having it out, okay? Who's going to step down? And this is a several-day standoff, okay? Who's going to step down? And basically it's, you remove your missiles. Will you remove your missiles, okay? But the way we like to present it sometimes is we like to leave out the idea that we had missiles in Turkey, okay? And we did. We had missiles in Turkey pointed at Soviet Union, and then they had missiles in Cuba pointed at us, all right? And not saying we didn't have a right to do that, but it wasn't unprompted. There's their missiles pointed at us. Again, it's scary, and especially for us, we're not used to having that direct threat. We're used to having more insulation because we have two major oceans, right? The Atlantic and the Pacific, that are blocking us or protecting us. And then, so onsets, you know, we have the Korean War, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis. These are all proxy situations. And then the third and final kind of proxy, and probably biggest, because of the toll and the death toll and how long it goes on, is definitely going to be the Vietnam War. All right, so let's talk about the Vietnam War for a couple of minutes. I lost my notes here. Where did they go? Vietnam War. Here we go. Okay, so Vietnam War, here's how it started. So when Vietnam was going through decolonization, the French actually asked us to aid them in the decolonization process as they were going through it. The French couldn't really control this. Communism was moving in, and we denied it. We said it wasn't our problem. We wouldn't help them. And the French wanted to aid in the setup of the decolonization process to ensure that they did not become communist. We refused. So the French pulled out too quickly, and then Northern communist regime under Ho Chi Minh started to move in, and we didn't like this, okay? And we backed the Southern non-communists, still very corrupt and unpopular, okay? And I always say this name wrong, so I apologize, okay? It's Ngoc Dinh Diem, okay? And just as corrupt, we backed the South, communists backed the North, Ho Chi Minh. All right, and so for a while we have this divided Vietnam, okay, where the North is communist and the South is non-communist. Not even that they're democratic, they're just non-communist. And this is during the JFK era, so 1961, 1963, all right? But then yet again, we see an invasion, kind of like what happened in Korea. We see an invasion of the North into the South, And we see an attack in the Gulf of Tonkin, so here in the northern region. Okay, we had a couple of warships up there. We saw some attacks on U.S. destroyers. Now, when the attacks on U.S. destroyers happened, this was a really big deal, okay? Like, this was a direct attack on the U.S. Like, how dare you not only invade the South, but how dare you attack U.S. ships? Like, this cannot happen. And so in 1966, President Lyndon Johnson is going to send 365,000 troops with the backing of Congress into Vietnam, and is going to start pushing back communism, okay, and Ho Chi Minh, again, with the same idea of what happened in Korea, to stop the spread of communism, to stop another country from falling into communism, okay? This went on for years, Between 1965 and 1973, over 1 million Vietnamese were killed and 58,000 U.S. soldiers were killed. The war was extremely unpopular in the U.S., and for a couple reasons. One, no strides were ever really made. It was one step forward, two steps back. Two, this was a war that was really impossible to ever win. And here's part of the problem. It was really hard to identify who the enemy was. So oftentimes the wrong people were being killed. You go into a village and you don't know who you're killing. You don't know, are you killing anti-communists or are you killing communists? Who are you killing? You're fighting a war in a jungle. The terrain alone was just so difficult. Foot rot. So many soldiers were having issues with foot rot because it's so damp and wet so much of the year. It was just, and again, at the end of the day, what are we gaining from this other than just reputation, other than, okay, we're stopping the spread of communism, but a lot of people argued that the man we were backing, and even people of Vietnam are like, the man you're backing isn't even a good man. He's not a good man. Like, he might not be communist, but he's not a good man. We don't want him. So it's like, what are we really even doing this for? It's costing us money. It's costing us time. We're losing our own men, and the people of Vietnam don't even want us here. It was a very, very unpopular war. Very, very unpopular war. So finally, in 1973, a treaty is reached where the U.S. agrees to leave. And basically, just like in North Korea at the 17th parallel, you can see here on the map, they agree that the North will become communist and the South will be anti-communist, okay? But this didn't last very long. 2 years later, 1975, the North will invade the South, okay? And the whole country will fall to communism and will rename the capital city Ho Chi Minh City. All right, and then signals a unification of Vietnam into a communist country. Now, we did not intervene in this because, again, there was no support for it. The view was, other than a name, what are we gaining from this? And the answer was nothing. Nothing. We aren't gaining anything. It's a localized conflict. It's a localized decision, and we gain nothing from it. And so why were we involved in the first place? And we were backing a regime that in some cases was even worse than the communist regime. You certainly couldn't argue that they were better. It was horrible. So this is really an example of what the Cold War is about. A lot of just replacing one regime with another and not even justifying that it was better per se. A lot of times it was just that, oh, you're not communist, well then you're perfect. Not really even caring how oppressive or how damaging that might be. So like I said, the North Vietnam led by Ho Chi Minh supported the guerrillas against the South non-communist. JFK sent troops to support the South, and then Lyndon Johnson sent in full support after the Gulf of Tonkin when the North attacked some U.S. destroyers. 365,000 soldiers initially were sent in. Our involvement lasted till 1973, and then that truce only lasted for 2 years, where the North was communist, the South was anti-communist, and then eventually the North invaded the South. We didn't intervene, and then the whole thing fell to communism. So basically, you go, what was the purpose of the Vietnam War? In the end, nothing, because in the end, Vietnam became communist. And anti-sentiment for the war, rose in the U.S., and we felt like, what are we doing? And really after that, you don't really see us getting involved in any more of these proxy wars. And this is why the Cold War starts to kind of die down, at least with these proxy wars at this point. Why are we getting involved in these communist, anti-communist, localized conflicts that really have nothing to do with us, just in the name of communism, when most of the time the regime we're backing isn't any better when you look at the 3 examples? The U.S. was kind of done with it. They were kind of tired. They were kind of tired for fighting for the sake of just fighting. Then you have other examples, like the formation of Israel, which caused a whole nother basket of conflict and problems in the Middle East. So the formation of Israel was official in 1947 when the U.S. voted to partition the area of Palestine into 2 states. Okay, so one was officially declared Israel in 1948, which was set aside for as a Jewish state. Okay, and this had a lot of international support, especially after the Holocaust. Right, when the horrors of the Holocaust came to light, people, internationally really were universally supportive of, they need a place to go, we need a place for relocation, restore the promised land and stuff. So this had great international support. Where it didn't have a lot of support was in Palestine, in the Middle East, which was dominantly Arabic Muslims, okay? Because that meant the relocation. So think kind of like India, the internal conflict, and with the divide of like Pakistan and India, how the conflict and the deaths. So think in the same way, now you have internal conflict between Jews and Muslims. In the same way, now you have the relocating of millions of people, millions of Muslims to carve out for Jews. So Jews are happy to be back, but Muslims are not happy. So it's at the cost of one group. So it's the success of one group at the cost of another group, if you can understand that, okay? So it creates a lot of hostilities, Still to this day, these hostilities are there. And still, the secondary area of Palestine that was set aside is still not recognized as a state. And this has been brought forth to the United Nations several times and has not been followed through on, that those who've been dislocated through the formation of Israel to set aside a state for Jews, those who've been dislocated, which is dominantly Muslims, who've been dislocated living in that kind of southern region of Israel, have never been then given a formalized state also. And so this has caused not only a lot of tensions, but what we would call proxy wars or skirmishes as well. So here's just an example of a couple of those. There are many, so we're just skimming the surface, but just a couple of those. So still to this day, like I said, Palestine is still trying for an independent state and has not happened. Because how some people view it is if you give support for that, then you're not giving support for the Jewish state. And if you give support for the Jewish state, then you're not giving support to Palestine. So it's a very divided topic. And Israel has long been one of the U.S.'s closest allies. So for the U.S. particularly, this is a very touchy, dividing topic when it comes to our Middle Eastern allies. Like, for example, we're very close with Saudi Arabia or sometimes with Egypt. So the topic of Israel can often be a very dicey topic when it comes to politics and economics and stuff like that. What's the #1 resource that comes out of the Middle East that everybody needs? You all should know this. Your parents complain about it. I complain about it all the time. Oil, gas prices, right? Why is it so high? I complained about it the other day, right? Spring break's coming up. We're like, gosh, gas prices are going high. Like, what the heck? Oh my gosh. Okay, oil. Guess where the world gets most of its oil? The Middle East, okay? So this isn't the only reason that we care about the Middle East by any means, okay? But this is why a lot of people continue to care about the Middle East, or a good reason, right? Is because economically, right? Everybody gains from the Middle East. So sometimes people go, well, why do we all engage? Why don't we just let them work it out? Because everybody economically, whether you're religious or not, everybody economically has something to lose when the Middle East is having problems. So this is why people stay involved, because everybody has their hand, so to speak, in the pot and wants things to be as settled as possible. So this is why it continues, not just for religious reasons or political reasons, but economic reasons, to be dicey, okay? So here are some examples of these tensions overflowing from time to time. Okay, there was a 6-day war in 1967, all right? Another example, so Yom Kippur is one of the, probably the most sacred holiday for Jews. And so the Egyptians invaded Israel or attacked Israel in 1973 on Yom Kippur, which is when there's no radios, no television. There's kind of like, if you're going to invade, this is actually a good day to invade because you're going to catch them with their guard down. And so they invaded, and this caused a huge issue. And OPEC started in 1973, cut off oil supplies, and there was an embargo. This pushed the U.S. to get involved, which normally we try to like not pick sides because our ally is Israel, but then we don't want to turn against Saudi Arabia or Egypt or things who we get a lot of oil from. So we're constantly like riding this fine line, but we had to get involved because it was punishing us because we didn't have, if we were supporting Israel, then we were getting cut off from oil from Egypt. So you see several examples of war, and then other powers will jump in and try to, cause peace. Or oil, the threat of keeping oil or withholding oil to get the U.S. or other powers to jump in and negotiate, or to jump in and take a side, and stuff like that. So if you're ever interested in Middle East politics or things like that, one, grab an aspirin or a Tylenol because it's super complicated and it will give you a headache. And two, it is very, very, very complicated because it's not just religion, it's not just economics, it's not just politics, it's all three, and they just all become interlaced, and it's very, very complicated. So throw the Cold War into that, and we still, to this day, it is, even with the Cold War being done, it's not over. So challenges of decolonization. Well, dozens of new nations are created. And with the dozens of new nations, most have little or no money, so therefore are economically needing backing, okay? What language are they going to teach? What educational institutions are they going to have? Are they going to be capitalists or not? How are they going to afford infrastructure? How are they going to build an army? How are they going to join the international community? Are they going to be accepted into the UN? And so during the Cold War, this was a manipulation that the US or the USSR, the Soviet Union, could use. Do you want to join the Soviet Union? Do you want to join the US? Do you want to get into United Nations? Well, we'll give you money. We'll give you trade tools, or we'll cut you off. So it could be the threat of being cut off, or it could be what you could have to gain. And so a lot of countries, not because they wanted to, but for lack of a better word, being bullied or forced for survival, were pushed to communism or were pushed away from communism, to one side or the other. And so the challenges of decolonization are the normal challenges of lack of education, lack of money, lack of infrastructure, but add to it the political tensions of the time, and the world becomes divided, and it is just really, really difficult for these little nations, and they're just kind of there for the picking for the larger nations like ourselves and the Soviet Union. In chapter 34, we'll talk about why the Cold War comes to an end. We'll talk about how the Berlin Wall and Germany becomes kind of the figurative epicenter of that and that teardown, okay? And then what does the world look like post-Cold War in chapter 35 a little bit, okay? I hope this was helpful. I hope you understand the essence of the Cold War, that it's not really a war, it's a proxy war, it's a tension, it's a divide. And then with decolonization, how deeply rooted this goes. So it's a series of events constantly in regions, in Africa, in India, in the Middle East, in Asia, that just constantly are little examples. Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam War, Korean War, in the Middle East with Israel, and on all these byproduct events and stuff of constant byproduct outplays of the bigger issue, which is communism versus anti-communism. It's not really about these countries playing it out. It's about their puppets for the big power players, and we use them to play out our arguments. It's kind of like parents who are fighting and they fight through their kids, or they use their kids, like in a messy divorce or something like that, you know? And that's very much what the Cold War is. They don't fight directly to each other's face. That would be another world war, which none of us want. But they use their children to do that. And let's be honest, it causes a lot of damage. It causes a lot of damage. It messed up Vietnam. You know, they had a lot of issues. Look at North Korea. It's still a mess. It's still North-South Korea. I mean, it's still divided. It's still completely divided, caused by the way it was divided up and the way that outside powers after World War II got involved. So we still have consequences of that. And who knows if and when they will fully be resolved. Okay? And we'll continue this discussion in chapter 34. Have a great day.